The only thing I wanted to say about this is that it's actually an excerpt from a longer piece, so I tried to pick pieces that would go together pretty well. All right. Am I too far away? It was almost my last day in France, a brilliant, brightly cold January day, and I was in a small fishing town named Sète on the Gulf of Lyons. Instead of Paris, I had chosen to visit this blue-collar port town with its picturesque downtown canal that can be walked in half an hour, and a seawall that can be walked in another half hour, at the end of which you can board a ferry for Morocco. A view of the entire town can be taken from a promontory in the hills above, at the top of a stairway of 1,000 stone steps. It doesn't look like much, but in fact this small village, 4 centuries old, is the largest working fishing port on the Mediterranean coast, and it really does earn its keep. Whereas most of the other ports have become sentimental destinations, more about tourism than industry, Sète has remained gritty and real. It's a place where, for all their charm, the cobblestone streets still reek of rotting octopus and salt water, where the workday begins long before dawn and ends at noon, where the street food is grilled oysters with melted garlic butter, and where the restaurants all close at 2, so that if you show up hungry at 1:30, like I did, you're just going to have to wait a few hours. In a word, Sète continues the traditions of an older France. The oysters sounded good, but the other local specialty was less appealing. Sète is known for a kind of octopus pot pie, the kind of thing you might come up with if you lived here in 1804 and all you had to work with was half a ton of octopus and several barrels of wine. When my guide told me about this dish, perhaps thinking I might want to try it for dinner, I said, maybe next time. She was a native of the town, an extraordinarily beautiful woman whose name I have now completely forgotten, but I'll never forget her face. If it had meant spending the evening with her, I would have gladly dined upon any bizarre local specialty for the privilege. But I was not there in order to have dinner with a beautiful woman. Not really. I was there on a pilgrimage of sorts, there to visit the birthplace and the grave of one of the town's most famous native sons, the poet and singer-songwriter Georges Brassens. It was likely I would never return here, and since I'd been obsessed with the man and his work for some years, I wanted to at least make the effort. But in a sense, skipping the more conventional tribute in order to enjoy an evening with a beautiful woman could be a more appropriate act of homage. For Brassens was no fan of conventional honors and formal tributes, and he was a tremendous fan of time spent with beautiful women. I could imagine his disbelief. You decided to visit my grave instead? After which he changed the subject, because there is no reasoning with someone whose priorities are so warped. On the other hand, we had a couple hours. Maybe I could do both. Wait, I said to her. Tell me more about the octopus. Although he died in 1981, and his heyday was the 50s and 60s, Brassens remains one of the most significant singer-songwriters of France. He's little known in the US, but in France he's an icon. Draw a drooping mustache, a pipe, and a guitar, and any French person will immediately name him. But he's not just a cartoon. His work is as familiar as that of Jacques Brel or Edith Piaf. But unlike those artists, his music is based in a rigorous aesthetic of direct simplicity. Himself on guitar, only a bass and another guitar to back him. His singing style was plain, but his voice is rich, a rolling baritone mellowed with ample tobacco and charm. He never acted in movies, never worked with orchestras, never wore a tuxedo, rarely toured, performed only his own music, and lived and composed in a tiny rented room in Paris for most of his adult life, unlike every single one of his contemporaries. He remained in many ways a true son of Sète. His significance in France is similar to that of Bob Dylan's here as a counterculture figure, but in other respects a better comparison is with the young Leonard Cohen. Like Cohen, Brassens was a brilliant composer, capable of writing simple but startlingly beautiful melodies and harmonies that stay with you forever, even if you don't understand the words. Indeed, I was drawn to his recordings before I even learned a single word of French. But just as with Cohen, the language is extremely important. Despite their immense talent as musicians, both men viewed themselves at the outset as primarily literary artists, poets first, singers second. And the literary quality of his verse is very high. He's seen as a classic poet worthy of close study. There's a widely available book of his collected verse, including all of his songs. Some of his verses even presented for analysis to students who hope to enter one of France's most prestigious schools. But all this official respect belies the fact that his words are distinctively anti-authoritarian, even anarchist. But anarchist with a sense of humor. He once said that he was so much an anarchist, he always crossed the street at the crosswalk so as to avoid ever having to talk to a policeman. The best one-line summary I found of his outlook is in the French Wikipedia article about him. Outside all established doctrine, supported by a marked individualism, a visceral anti-militarism, a profound atheism, and total contempt for comfort, money, or fame. And I would add, Brassens is the preeminent poet of misfits and malcontents, what Kenneth Rexroth calls the hardcore unassimilables, those people who refuse to be or who cannot be assimilated into the mainstream. He intensely identified with the underdog, with the outsider, with those who are abused and exploited and then blamed for their situation, like prostitutes and migrant workers, about whom he wrote powerful songs of protest. And his work is infused throughout with a vulgarity and an impish spirit. In the light of all this, it's not too surprising that there's a non-ironic cover band that does his songs as hardcore punk. Can you imagine punk Piaf? I can't, but punk croissants works pretty well. Another great theme of his verse is women and sex. Much of the time this means body song, in a tradition that goes back to Rabelais, and the target of this humor, typically, is male narcissism and the absurd insistence of male desire. When he turns from satire to serious thoughts about men and women, although he wasn't a feminist per se, he was certainly no misogynist. His contemporary, Jacques Brel, wrote genuine anthems of hatred for all womankind, but Croissants got past that adolescent narcissism early on. His songs of love, whether of successful or failed affairs, show an awareness that his lovers are intelligent beings with separate needs, ambitions, and desires, that they are not merely the objects of his lust and longing, not merely the instruments of his satisfaction or disappointment. It's an awareness that sadly remains rare in song, though I think that's not a failure of feminism, but more because artists in general simply resist growing the fuck up.
Damn!
My favorite of these love songs was written for the actual love of his life, with whom he was in a monogamous relationship for over 3 decades. They never married, for reasons beautifully set out in his song, The Non-Proposal. He opens by saying to his lover, "Let's never hold Cupid's own arrow against his throat." And most of the subsequent verses develop this idea of marriage and domestic life in particular as the killer of passionate love. One verse concludes, "The ink on love letters fades fast between the pages of a cookbook." The refrain, "I have the honor of not asking your hand in marriage, let's not sign our names at the bottom of a parchment," is partly an anarchist protest against the intrusion of the state into private relationships. But what's most touching about this song is its last theme, fidelity with freedom. He rejects marriage because he believes it would destroy her freedom as well as his, but suggests, "Let's leave the open field to the birds and be one another's prisoner by our word alone. As your eternal fiancé, I will always be thinking of you, the woman of my dreams." Thank you.